Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in the Harvard Classics Lectures of Volume 4. This is, of course, the Milton volume, and I'm in Lecture 33 now. This is our summary comments on Paradise Regained Final Thoughts. Now, I'm going to say what I always say at the beginning of these lectures. I do recommend that if you haven't done it, you go back to learnstrong.net, go down that left-hand side, find the Harvard Classics folder, go ahead and take a look at first my Paradise Lost lectures and then, of course, my Paradise Regained lectures. I think that can be of great help to you as we get ready now for our final comments on Paradise Regained. We want to make now some conclusive comments, not only about Paradise Regained, but I think as well about Paradise Lost. And I want to answer this question: why is it that sometimes people think Paradise Regained is a weaker epic poem than Paradise Lost? I think I've already said a few times in my lectures to you that I think Paradise Regained is every bit as strong, if not stronger, and certainly maybe even more challenging as a text. And I'll try and make some observations about that. We've tried to use Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained, as we do, of course, with all of our texts in 303, as an attempt to try to learn through connecting new information to old information. And I hope that we do that this lecture, and I hope that we challenge you in some way to at least think a little bit about some of the ideas that Milton is playing with. Of course, we've been working with our three levels of reading. What does the text say? What does the text mean? How do I relate to the text? This series of comments will work predominantly at levels 2 and 3. Okay? My assumption is that you already know what happens in Paradise Regained. Just to remind, we've been working with this text from three perspectives. One, we've asked, what is it as an epic? Two, we've asked about Paradise Regained as we've asked about Paradise Lost, about the philosophic or the theological instantiations, like what does it mean philosophically, theologically, and then finally politically, both from the psychological, the individual level, as well as the sociological level. So let's turn now to each of these in order, and let's just make some quick and summative observations, beginning with Paradise Regained as epic poem. Let's think about this for a moment. Paradise Regained is going to, of course, tell the story of the three classic temptations that Satan gives to Christ in the two gospel accounts of Matthew 4, Luke 4. Milton was interested in Luke 4 more than Matthew 4 because the ordering of the temptations is different. And I'm going to make the argument that I think Milton was onto something with the ordering of the temptations in Luke 4 being a little bit more philosophically and theologically acceptable. But let's think about this poem, Paradise Regained, as an epic poem where, of course, if we've studied at all anything about epics, we know there's an epic hero. Well, of course, in Paradise Regained, there's no complications at all about who the hero is. As in, for example, Paradise Lost, well, maybe it's Satan, or maybe it's God, or maybe it's Adam, or maybe it's Eve, who, for example, has enough courage to eat from the forbidden fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In Paradise Regained, it is clear to everyone that's reading this poem that the hero is Christ, the Son of God, Jesus. Of course, you got to have an epic adversary, and here clearly it is Satan. And of course, they have to fight, or they have to struggle. Think about the linguistic fights that go on, and the fact that, as we said several times, this is a text about interpretation, hermeneutics. In fact, even in the Luke 4 passage, there is the exchange of ideas through biblical text or Hebrew Old Testament text. Christ always is going to quote from the book of Deuteronomy. The devil will quote from the book of Psalms in the exchanges that happen. Of course, this struggle reminds us of the linguistic struggle, the opening book of Homer's Iliad, where you, of course, have that famous struggle or fight between two major heroes who are arguing linguistically. We think, of course, of the struggle of the test as well in our comments about Dante and that trip through the underworld, of course, in the first part of the Divine Comedy, the Inferno. We have epic catalogs, of course, as we've pointed out many times. I've said it, Mommy Milton showing off again in my prior lectures. That is to say, there's things that he knows that other people just don't know. For example, in the Paradise Regained, we actually get in Book 4 some mention of where Homer actually came from, because Milton knows that he was born next to a river in Ionia. And so you've got these kinds of amazing references from Milton's classical studies prodigious knowledge that he has. Of course, we have the epic similes. This can't surprise us as we're students of the English language. The epic similes and metaphors, the figurative language that's a part of it. We have the epic symbolism, of course, of mountains and trees and all other kinds of, ideas that are related to that kind of symbolism. We have epic rhetoric, of course, as well. The speeches, which will remind us of the power of speech. Also, it will remind us that Milton himself was a politician in Parliament, and he knew all about giving speeches and having to sit through long speeches, like you guys who have to sit through these long lectures. Thank you very much. We have what I'm going to call epic intentionality. And by that I mean that epic poems have a purpose. If you want to know about the Anglo-Saxon Code, you study Beowulf. That's going to tell you about it. If you want to know about Milton's intentionality, Milton's purpose, I think you have to look at Paradise Regained, not just Paradise Lost, which is one of the reasons why I'm going to make the argument. This is such a powerfully important text for us. Let's move now to this text from its philosophic, theological, political instantiations, because I think here Paradise Regained has much to offer. Of course, we continue with the discussion of theodicy. That is to say, don't blame God for the fact that there's all this terrible stuff that happens in the world. Now, in Paradise Regained, the theodicic project is understood from a little bit more complicated idea. Here, without actually saying it, Milton will say that God the Father will test the Son by two things. One, sending him into the desert wilderness where he's not going to eat for 40 days. He is again on the outside of what humans can do without food for 40 days. Again, about 50 days, the human body begins to die from starvation. So we're right on the edge for 40 days. We're right on the edge of what's allowable or acceptable. But then, of course, it's clear from Milton's perspective, God allows Satan to come and tempt Christ, just like God allows Satan to tempt Adam and then by extension Eve. I think though that there is in Paradise Regained an even more interesting philosophic understanding of what's going on here. And I think there's a way to read these three temptations philosophically. I think that Milton likes the order of the temptations in Luke 4 better than the temptations in Matthew 4. And I'm going to let you kind of see where the inverse happens. It's between those last two. And I think Milton likes the order because I think he's working with a philosophic, theological understanding and a symbolism that considers the power of each of the three temptations symbolically or metaphorically, because I think Milton, agreeing with the perennial philosophy of Huxley and a whole lot of other people call this, Houston Smith, the perennial philosophy, that in fact the human being is three: a body, a mind, a spirit. And I think that the number three is obviously very important in Trinitarian theological studies and all of that, Christian theology. The threes are always important, right? But let's look at each of these temptations now briefly. And let's point out the ways philosophically Milton is playing some powerful games with us. And by the way, it doesn't have to matter whether you're a reader of the Bible or any other religious text. It doesn't have to matter whether you believe in God or believe in Christ the Son or believe in the Trinity or any of those kinds of Christian dogmas. You don't have to believe in any of that to, I think, be moved by this philosophic question that's being asked here. Take a look. Temptation number one is, of course, well, you haven't eaten for 40 days, so what are your thoughts? How about this? Let's go ahead and make some bread out of stone, right? And let's eat. Now, of course, a number of theologians and philosophers have pointed out that the request to make bread out of stone is, of course, metaphorically expedient because, of course, all stone is hardened rock. And, of course, rock is really nothing more than dirt. And, of course, dirt comes, as the important precedent for anything that you're going to do in terms of what you're going to grow for bread. In other words, the only way you get bread is grain. The only way you get grain is out of the dirt. Do you get me? So, in other words, there's clearly a referencing here to this notion of how everything works out. But I want to point out this one. The turning the bread to, or stone to bread is, of course, going to treat the physical, the body. You got to eat something, which begs some really interesting questions like, what will you eat? How will you sustain yourself? What will be the way you survive physically in this world? Right? This is, of course, concerns about the body, which is primarily physical needs and therefore individual needs. But the second temptation, remember, is bow down and worship me. I will give you total power. I will give you everything. Right? By the way, we do think about the judgment of Paris, as it's sometimes referred to, when Paris is offered by the three goddesses those three kinds of opportunities, and the goddesses are going to give back to Paris certain kinds of opportunities as well. One of those, of course, is that idea of power, military power, glory, fame, all of that kinds of stuff. It seems to me that this one is not so much about the body physical, but rather about the intellectual, the mental, the second of those three things that you are, body, mind, spirit. And as mind, here's the question. What work will you do? Right? This, of course, is concerning oneself with maybe others, the sociological component. How will you survive intellectually? How important is fame, glory, ambition to you? We think of Beowulf as soon as we think of these notions of glory, fame, and ambition. We think of Milton's own struggle. I'll have more to say about that in a moment. These are concerns not of the body, but rather of the mind. But finally, there's the third temptation. You'll remember. Satan will take Christ to Mount Zion, to Jerusalem. He'll take him to the top of the temple, and he'll say, jump. There is this prophecy in Psalms that says, if you're the Son of God, you will be saved. God's response, Christ's response to Satan is, don't tempt the Lord your God, and he quotes from Deuteronomy. But I want to point out that I believe that Milton recognizes this is a spiritual kind of temptation. The temptation of what will you believe, or who will you believe in? For example, believe in self, believe in others, possibly God. How will you survive spiritually? Now, of course, let's point out, this question of jumping is literally the question of suicide. Let's not be confused, right? The question of suicide. That is to say, if I jump from this really high place, I will not survive the fall. That's why angels have to catch me. That's the referencing for Satan to the Psalm passage, right? Of course, the question of suicide is not new to Milton. It was right there in Paradise Lost. You'll remember, after Adam and Eve have both eaten of the forbidden fruit, one of the things they go through is, well, we're pretty much jacked. Maybe we should just off ourselves. And for them, especially for Eve, the argument is simple. Why would we have children, which would then create the race of humankind? And then there will be all these problems. Like, it'd be a whole lot better to just go ahead and off ourselves now. Adam's response is, yeah, that's not a good way to think. We are God's creation, and there's absolutely no responsible act that ends in suicide. Of course, because we're talking Milton, we have to think Shakespeare, and because we're thinking Shakespeare, we have to think Hamlet, to be or not to be, right? Might his quietus make with a bare bodkin? In other words, why do we put up with this, living in this terrible world, to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune? What will you believe? Who will you believe? How will you survive spiritually? Think about the moment of one's death. Think about the comments that I made in Plato's classic dialogue, the Phaedo, where right before Socrates drinks his hemlock shake and dies, he's having this incredible discussion about the soul, about afterlife. I think that the third temptation really does beg the spiritual quest. Beyond the physical, beyond the mental, is the third test, the third temptation, the third quandary, the spiritual quandary. I believe that Milton is dealing with ultimate concern in Paradise Regained. Now, question, why does Milton add all these other temptations? Because, as we've been saying in Paradise Regained, there are all these other temptations. The temptation of fame and glory, the temptation of becoming a king through warfare and creating an army and all of that. The temptation of weather and terrible dreams. The temptation of doubts and skepticism. In fact, we began Paradise Regained with some thought about the skepticism involved, for example, of those who watched him be baptized and heard the voice out of heaven and all of that. I think Milton, now to answer the question about what's going on with Paradise Lost versus Paradise Regained, I think Milton is writing Paradise Lost specifically for others, to justify the ways of God to men. I think Milton is writing Paradise Regained for himself. Now, I've been mentioning this through earlier lectures, and now I want to come to a conclusion comment on this. I believe that the single most important, to call him a contemporary is pushing it, right? Because really Milton pretty much is born right about the time Shakespeare gets ready to end his career. 1611, he writes and publishes Tempest, which we believe is his last text, and Milton is born 1608. But I want to argue that Shakespeare is always looming there, as I've said at the conclusion in my comments on Paradise Lost, and I think Shakespeare's Tempest is what's standing for Milton right there at the end of his life. Remember, Paradise Regained is some of the last words poetically that Milton will write. And what's going on with this referencing of Tempest? We, for example, mentioned that prosper, the word prosper, is actually in the opening lines of this poem. Prospero, of course, is the hero of Tempest. We've mentioned that the word tempest actually gets used in the 4th book of Paradise Regained. But now I think it's time for us to take a look at Tempest and to ask some questions about those final lines. Of course, those are lines we've studied together and you know well, but let's look at them again. The epilogue of Tempest. Prospero speaks, "Now my charms are all overthrown, and what strength I have's mine own, which is most faint." Prospero says it. Many have said this is Shakespeare's final words, as he's delivering them for the last time to the audience that he has grown to love and, of course, respect. And he says it, "I'm growing faint, I'm getting old." You get a lot of that sense in Paradise Regained, that Milton is aware that he is growing older, fainter. "Now 'tis true," I'm reading again from Tempest, "I must be here confined by you, or sent to Naples. Let me not, since I have my dukedom got, and pardoned the deceiver, dwell in this bare island by your spell." We think of the wilderness, right, that Christ is in Paradise Regained. "But release me from my bands with the help of your good hands. Gentle breath of yours my sails must fill, or else my project fails, which was to please." It's beautiful, of course, poetry, isn't it, that Shakespeare will say at the conclusion of his life's work, "I only wanted to please." I think Milton knows these lines, and I think he knows them well. "Now," he says to finish, "I want spirits to enforce, art to enchant, and my ending is despair, unless I be relieved by prayer, which pierces so that it assaults mercy itself and frees all faults. As for you, from crimes would pardon be, let your indulgence set me free." If the last word that Shakespeare ever did write for his playwriting career was the word free, we're happy that he did so. And I think Milton is definitely dealing with some challenges here that are clearly Shakespearean. What kind of challenges? I think it's in that temptation regarding ambition. I think that Milton, as we have said from the very beginning of our comments, struggled with the idea of, on the one hand, his prodigious talent, and on the other hand, the story of Matthew 25 in the gospel account. When Christ tells the story of the father who leaves talents to 3 sons and goes away, and that final youngest son buries his talent and does not use it. As I said in my opening comments about Milton, this is huge. Think of it. 3 things. 1, Milton knows he's brilliant, beyond, exceptional, beyond anybody else. He knows it. His intellectual capacities from a young age are chronicled in a number of different places. Milton clearly knew he was genius. Number 2, Milton is a devout believer in God, a Puritan Christian, a devout believer in God. And therefore, he doesn't just read the Matthew 25 story as a throwaway story. No. This is not just some kind of moral tale that says you should probably try your best. No, Milton believes that his talent has been given to him by God. Now, of course, just to return to earlier comments, we have played this game before already with 2 sonnets. I want to come back to those sonnets now at the conclusion of our comments. The first of those 2 sonnets is called On His Being Arrived to the Age of 23, from 1631. Think about your dates, right? 1631 is when he writes this poem at 23. He will publish Paradise Lost at 1667, and then 1671 is Paradise Regained. So think about that distance of time. At a very young age, at 23, Milton is already assured that he is wasting his days because he's done nothing great at 23. How soon hath time, the subtle thief of youth, stolen on his wing my 23 year. My hastening days fly on with full career, but my late spring no bud or blossom showeth. Perhaps my semblance might deceive the truth that I to manhood am arrived so near, and inward ripeness doth much less appear, that some more timely happy spirits endureth. Of course, this whole notion of fruit and ripening, now that you know your Milton, will resonate. Yet be it less or more, or soon or slow, it shall be still in strictest measure even to that same lot, however mean or high, towards which time leads me in the will of heaven. All is, if I have grace to use it so, as ever in my great taskmaster's eye. And that taskmaster, of course, is that potentially returning father. It will be later, in 1655, at the age of 47, that Milton will write one of his last poems when he can see. Of course, remember, he is completely blind when he produces the some 10,000 lines of Paradise Lost. He cannot see when he writes Paradise Regained. And right before he goes blind, he is still dealing with the same issue. What is that issue? When I consider how my light is spent, ere half my days in this dark world and wide, and that one talent which is death to hide lodged with me